Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of my Starbound Modding 101 tutorials. Today, as you can see on the screen here, we're going to be talking about Lua Script. Now, as we've talked about before, there are two main components to the files that we can mod in Starbound. There are the JSON files, JSON, and that's an acronym. Lua actually is not an acronym, it's just the name of the scripting language. Lua is considerably more complicated than JSON, because JSON is just a storage format and Lua is an actual coding language. So you need to be familiar with how that works. We're just going to do a brief overview today. We're not going to dive too far in. But as you can see, I am on the lua.org website, and this gives some helpful information about what Lua is and why you might want to use it. And you can peruse that in your own time here, but mainly what we want to talk about is what Lua is. Lua is a powerful, fast, lightweight, embeddable scripting language. And what that means is Lua can be used in conjunction with other programming languages like C or C++ to make games like Starbound. And it's called a high-level programming language, which means that it's relatively easy to code in compared to other programming languages. So again, you can check out the site. It also has some documentation. If you click on the documentation tab, there's all sorts of different resources for learning Lua Script, and it's great to check out. You can also, if you ever run into any specific issues, you can just Google online and find answers to a lot of simple Lua questions. So we're going to actually start by jumping into Starbound. And let me I've got the volume pretty high on my Starbound here. So what we're going to do is actually take a look at a modded tech that I've created. And we'll use this as an example of Lua Script. So this tech, at its core, is run by a Lua Script. So we're going to I'll show you what it does. So essentially all that it does is when I press F, it turns me into this little mouse. And a lot of this functionality of this mouse, essentially all it does is it makes me run a little bit faster, jump a little bit higher, and it makes me small so I can fit into smaller spaces. So it's a handy little tech. And a lot of this functionality, this jumping and how the mouse animates and things like that, a lot of that is guided with Lua Script. So remember, when I press F, I can activate or deactivate it, and when it's active, I can press spacebar to jump, and the image of the tech flips when I have my mouse facing left or right, and all of these things are all done in Lua Script. So we're gonna, now that you've seen what the tech does, we're gonna actually go into the tech file itself. So this is the Lua Script for the mouse tech. And the first line that you'll see here, it says function. And functions are very important in Lua or any coding language at all. In fact, you'll see them all over the place. And basically what it is this is a self-contained almost box, you could think of it as, that starts with the word function and ends with the word end, and everything inside here happens whenever you use this function. So we'll go through the different parts. You start a function by typing the word function to tell the code that it's going to be a function, and then here's the name of the function, init. So this is short for initialize. And the third thing that we see here is an empty set of parentheses. Now in this case, the parentheses are empty, which means we are not taking in any values from other parts of the code. But sometimes there can be things within these parentheses. You'll see, like this function down here, we see that we have the word args being passed in, and that is something that's predefined in the code elsewhere. It's short for arguments, and it means that we're passing in values from other parts of the code when we run that function. So in this case, we're not passing in any values. So then we go ahead and start these lines of code that are within our function. We're not going to go through these things too much, but basically what we're seeing here is a whole bunch of variables that are being created in our code, and we're setting them to their initial values. This function is called automatically by the Starbound code whenever we equip this tech. So as soon as this tech is equipped in our inventory, we don't even have to have activated it yet. This initialize or init function is called, and all these things happen. So let's take a look here. This is an example of a function being called. So when we see this line, it means that we are going to do this function, the set visible function in this case. If we were to use the init function, we could declare it like this: init done. So this, writing this would call this function, and it would do all the things that are within this function. So we're doing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines of code, all with one function call. And that's the nice thing about functions, is if we want to do this function over and over again, it only takes one line. And this function could be 100 lines long, but we always call it with one line elsewhere in the code. So it saves a lot of space if you're using a function over and over again. But we don't even need to call this function because this function's already being called again elsewhere in the code when we start up the tech. So this is another function, uninit, and we can probably guess what this does. It uninitializes the tech when you unequip it from your inventory. So in here we see something interesting. This is an if statement, and it works. It's formatted kind of like a function. A function starts with function and ends with the word end. An if statement starts with if and ends with end. That tells you that the if statement's over. But then it's got an interesting thing here in the middle. It's got this then statement. So what this is doing is it's saying if self.active. So this is a variable that tells us, are we active or are we not active? So if self.active, which means if self.active equals true. So if we are active, then, so if the if is the condition, then means what happens. So if everything inside of this if statement will only happen if the tech is active. So if the tech is active, then do these things. And these are all the different uninitialize variables that we want to set whenever we unequip the tech. Because if we don't reset all these variables, we'll end up with weird things. Like even when we take our tech out of our inventory, then maybe our character will be stuck in like the sitting position or something like that, or whatever the tech has set you to, and you'll have to restart the game. So the uninitialize function is very important to set it all back to normal when you unequip the tech. So we've got this function called input. This is another function that is automatically called in the Starbound code, and it's called whenever you press a key. And that's what is passed to this function in the args, in this args variable here. It passes what key you pressed. And this, you can think about this function being called whenever a key is pressed. So every time you press the F key or the R key or the Q key or you press a mouse button, this function is called. And it could be called 100 times a second, or it could be just called 1 time a second, just depending on how many times you press the keys. So inside this function, that is how we tell the tech to do things when we press a key. So in this case, there's only one thing that we do with a key press, and that's activating or deactivating the mouse tech. So here, down here, we see another variable being declared. We are creating a variable called special last, and we're setting it equal to, or I'm sorry, we are just, this is the same variable as we have up here, this special last. So this is where we're setting special last equal to false, and here we're setting special last equal to true or false, depending on whether the special key was pressed. So if in our case, the special key is F. So if we pressed F, then it sets special last equal to true, because F was pressed. And that's how we know whether the tech is active or inactive at the time that we press the F key. So now we see one other little line down here, this return statement. This is how we get something out of our function. So ordinarily, the rest of our code doesn't know what's going on inside each of these functions. They're sort of their own little box here. But they do have the option to take things in, which are these arguments within these parentheses, and they have the option to send things out, and that's what these return statements do. So we're returning the value of this variable move, and if we need to use that elsewhere in the code, then we now can, because this function is giving it back to us. So we're going to go down this other function, update. This is probably the most important function in any Lua script. You'll find this function in most of the Lua scripts in Starbound, but particularly you'll find it in text. And what this update function does is it is called, I believe, many, many times a second. It's been constantly called, and it's checking different things. So like, it's been called 100 times a second just to check where you are, what you're doing, what state you're in, basically. So in the case of the mouse tech, we've got some if statements in here. If self-active, so if the tech is active and you press the button to activate the tech, then it does all the things to change things. So it sets your tech to visible. It creates particles, some little sparkles when you activate the tech or something like that. It sets all these different directives. We can't go through all of these right now. We'll go through these more in later episodes. But basically, this is what makes your mouse do what he does, is this update function, because it's constantly checking to see what keys you've pressed, what direction you're heading, and so this does the meat and potatoes of the Lua script here. And that's pretty much it for this Lua script. We can, we've gone over if statements. You can also see, you'll see if and then. You can also have if and then statements inside of if statements. You can also have else statements, which means if this condition is true, then do this. Otherwise, if it's false, do this. So you can give it two different options. So this is some basics of Lua script. Again, I don't want to dive in too deeply because a lot of it just takes some basic knowledge of scripting, some basic coding knowledge, and just practice. Honestly, the best way to get familiar with Lua scripts is just practice, look at them, find a tech that you like, just like we did, play around with it in Starbound, give it a try, see what it does, see what keys are pressed, and then go into its Lua file, find it in the assets, and look at the code and see if you can make sense of it. See if there are things that sound familiar, and just try and kind of pick it apart. Lua script is complicated. Don't get discouraged if you don't pick it up right away, because it is probably the most complex concept in Starbound modding that you can get into. But it's really, really powerful. It's so powerful, and if you can get the hang of it, it's amazing. You can do some amazing things with it. So we're just going to close this out. Close this tutorial video out by just talking about the next tutorial series that I want to make. This is actually going to be the last in this 101 modding beginner series. But don't worry, we are actually starting a brand new series that's going to cover some more complicated topics and actually some more specific modding topics. Because I can go down rabbit holes all day long and go into all sorts of specific modding examples, but I want to keep this series for basic modding principles, and then I'll start a new series that talks about specific modding examples. For instance, people wanted to go through how to make an NPC, how you make a dungeon, how you make a ship, how you make a new race, and we're going to go through some of that in this next series. So thanks for watching, and we're going to wrap it up, and congratulations on finishing the 101 tutorial series. Have a good one.